What happens when a battle-hardened soldier, trained to see the enemy as nothing more than a uniform and a threat, comes face to face with the raw humanity behind that enemy line? This is the story of one British soldier's encounter in the shattered ruins of Germany, 1945. A moment that would challenge everything he thought he knew about war, compassion, and the invisible line between victor and vanquished. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into the heart of Germany. The British Second Army, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was pushing through the industrial heartland, encountering not just Wehrmacht resistance, but a civilian population devastated by years of total war. In these final, chaotic weeks, British soldiers of the 7th Armoured Division, the famed Desert Rats, would witness scenes that no amount of training had prepared them for. Lance Corporal Thomas Fletcher of the 1st Battalion Rifle Brigade had survived the beaches of Normandy, the bitter fighting through the bocage, and the winter hell of the Ardennes. At 23 years old, he was already a veteran, his face lined beyond his years, his eyes carrying the weight of too many friends buried in foreign soil. By April 1945, Fletcher's company was advancing through the Ruhr Valley, clearing pockets of resistance in towns that had been reduced to skeletal ruins by Allied bombing. The strategic situation was clear. Germany was finished. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was crumbling after just 12 years. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east, while American, British, and Canadian armies swept in from the west. Yet even in defeat, scattered Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units fought on, some from fanatical devotion, others simply because they knew no alternative. For the British soldiers advancing through these devastated towns, each building could hide a sniper, each cellar could conceal a desperate last stand. But there was another enemy here, one that wore no uniform and carried no weapon: starvation. Years of Allied strategic bombing, the collapse of the German transportation network, and the diversion of all resources to the Wehrmacht had created a humanitarian catastrophe among German civilians. In the cities and towns of Western Germany, women, children, and the elderly were facing mass starvation. Food supplies had virtually disappeared. Clean water was scarce. Disease was spreading. For British soldiers like Fletcher, this presented a moral complexity that the chaos of combat had never forced them to confront. These were the people of the nation that had bombed London, that had unleashed a war of unprecedented brutality. Yet here they were, gaunt, terrified, desperate. The official British policy was clear. Fraternization with German civilians was strictly forbidden. They were not to be helped, not to be trusted, not to be treated as anything other than the defeated enemy. On April 17, 1945, Fletcher's platoon received orders to clear and secure the small town of Waltringen, approximately 15 miles northeast of Duisburg. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy presence, perhaps a few stragglers from a decimated Volkssturm unit, the hastily assembled militia of old men and boys that represented Germany's last desperate attempt at defense. The platoon moved through the town in standard tactical formation, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning every window, every doorway. The silence was oppressive. No civilians appeared on the streets. No white flags hung from the shattered windows. The only sounds were the crunch of rubble beneath their boots and the distant rumble of artillery from the next sector. "Place feels like a bloody graveyard," muttered Private Davies, Fletcher's closest mate from training days back in England. A lifetime ago, it seemed. The buildings told the story of what had happened here. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble by bombing raids. Those structures still standing were gutted shells, their roofs collapsed, their walls pockmarked with shrapnel. This had been a small industrial town, probably produced ball bearings or steel components for the German war machine. Now it produced nothing but dust and silence. By 1400 hours, The platoon had secured the town center without encountering any resistance. Their platoon commander, Lieutenant Morrison, a former schoolteacher from Surrey who'd received his commission just 8 months earlier, ordered them to establish a defensive perimeter and prepare to bivouac for the night. Intelligence suggested they'd be holding this position for at least 24 hours before moving forward again. Fletcher's section was assigned to secure a 3-story building that had once been an apartment block. The structure was relatively intact compared to its neighbors. Only the top floor had sustained serious damage. As the men moved through the building, clearing each room, Fletcher felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through nearly a year of combat. Every closed door could mean danger. The ground floor was empty except for overturned furniture and scattered possessions, photographs, books, a child's toy soldier ironically lying face down in the dust. The first floor revealed more of the same, signs of hasty evacuation, lives interrupted and abandoned. Then Fletcher heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination, a whimper, soft, quickly stifled, coming from somewhere above. He raised his fist, signaling the men behind him to halt. Private Davies moved up beside him, his Sten gun raised. They'd encountered situations like this before, German soldiers hiding among civilians, waiting for the right moment to strike. Standard procedure was to call out a warning in German, then clear the room with grenades if there was no immediate surrender. Fletcher moved slowly up the stairs to the second floor, every sense alert. The sound had come from the third room on the left. He was certain of it. The door was partially closed. Through the gap he could see nothing but shadows. "Kommen Sie heraus, Hände hoch," Fletcher called out, the phrase every Allied soldier had memorized. Come out, hands up. Silence, then again that faint whimpering sound. But this wasn't the sound of a soldier preparing to fight. This was the sound of fear, pure, helpless fear. Fletcher moved to the door and pushed it open with his rifle barrel, staying to the side in case shots came through. None did. He swung into the doorway, rifle aimed into the room. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the corner of the room, pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear into it, was a German woman holding 2 small children. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, though malnutrition and fear had aged her beyond recognition. Her dress hung on a skeletal frame. Her cheekbones protruded sharply. Her eyes, wide with terror, were sunken deep into her skull. But it was the children that stopped Fletcher's heart. A girl, perhaps 5 years old, clung to her mother's side, her tiny face buried against her mother's shoulder. A boy, no more than 3, was in his mother's arms, too weak, it seemed, to even lift his head. Both children were alarmingly thin, their arms like sticks, their skin stretched tight over bones. Fletcher had seen death in countless forms over the past year. He'd seen men torn apart by shrapnel, burned alive in tanks, shot through the head by snipers. He developed the soldier's necessary callousness, the ability to witness horror and continue functioning. But this was different. This wasn't the death of combat. This was the slow, grinding death of starvation. These people weren't dying from bullets or bombs. They were dying because there was nothing to eat. The woman's lips moved, forming words in German that Fletcher couldn't understand. Her voice was barely a whisper. Then she said something he did understand, a single word repeated like a prayer. "Bit, bit, bit, please." Behind Fletcher, Davies had entered the room. He cursed softly under his breath. "Christ, Fletch, look at them." Fletcher lowered his rifle slowly, making no sudden movements. The woman flinched anyway, pulling her children closer, as if her emaciated body could somehow shield them from harm. Her eyes never left Fletcher's face, searching, pleading, resigned to whatever came next. "We need to report this to the lieutenant," Davies said quietly. Fletcher nodded, but he couldn't look away from the woman's eyes. In them he saw something that stripped away all the carefully constructed barriers between soldier and enemy. He saw a mother who had failed at the one thing that mattered most, keeping her children alive. He saw desperation so complete that death might actually be a mercy. The boy in her arms whimpered again, a weak mewling sound like a starving kitten. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Fletcher had seen enough dying men to recognize the signs. This child was very close to the end. The official policy was clear. Do not fraternize. Do not provide aid to German civilians. They are the enemy population. They supported the Nazi regime. They cheered as Hitler's armies conquered Europe. Whatever suffering they now endured, they had brought it upon themselves. But policy hadn't looked into these eyes. Policy hadn't seen this mother's desperation or these children's silent agony. Policy was written in offices far from the ruins and the starvation and the human cost of this terrible war. Fletcher's hand moved to his webbing to the pocket where he carried his rations. Today's allocation was still there. A tin of corned beef, hard biscuits, a small bar of chocolate, and a packet of tea. Enough to keep a soldier functioning for 24 hours. Enough, perhaps, to keep a dying child alive for another day. Fletch de... Vise said, a warning in his voice. You know the rules, mate. Fraternization is a court-martial offense. Morrison catches you giving them rations, you're done. Fletcher knew Davies was right. He'd seen soldiers disciplined for less. Just last week, a corporal from B Company had been stripped of his rank for giving cigarettes to German prisoners. The orders came from the very top. Montgomery himself had made it clear. No sympathy, no compassion. These people were to be left to face the consequences of their nation's actions. But Fletcher was thinking about his own sister back in Surrey. She had 2 children, a girl and a boy, almost exactly the same ages as these German children. He'd last seen them in 1944, before the invasion. The girl had hugged him fiercely, making him promise to come home. The boy had been too young to understand, had simply stared at Fletcher's uniform with wide eyes. What if it had been England that lost the war? What if it had been British cities reduced to rubble, British civilians starving in the ruins? What if it had been his sister huddled in a corner, holding her dying children, watching as enemy soldiers discovered them? Fletcher made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He unslung his rifle, letting it hang from its strap, and reached into his webbing. The woman's eyes widened in fresh terror. Perhaps she thought he was reaching for a weapon, that he intended to end their suffering with bullets rather than compassion. Instead, Fletcher pulled out his ration tin. The woman stared at it, not comprehending. Fletcher held it out toward her, took a step closer. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her body trembling. "It's all right," Fletcher said softly, knowing she probably couldn't understand the words but hoping his tone would convey his intent. "It's food. For the children." He took another step forward and placed the tin on the floor, then stepped back. The woman's eyes moved from Fletcher's face to the tin and back again. Her expression was one of utter disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend why an enemy soldier would offer food rather than a bullet. Fletcher pulled out his chocolate bar, his biscuits, everything edible he carried. He placed each item on the floor, creating a small pile of sustenance that represented his own survival for the next day. He'd go hungry. He'd face the lieutenant's questions about why he had no rations. He'd deal with whatever consequences came. None of it mattered compared to what he was looking at in this room. "Fletch, you're completely mad," Davies whispered. But even as he said it, Davies was reaching into his own webbing, pulling out his rations, adding them to the pile. "Bloody hell, Morrison's going to have our guts for garters." The woman's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion beyond fear that Fletcher had seen in her face. She stared at the pile of food as if it were a hallucination, something her starving mind had conjured from desperate hope. Then, moving slowly as if afraid any sudden motion would make it disappear, she shifted the boy in her arms and reached out with a trembling hand. Her fingers touched the chocolate bar, just touched it, as if confirming it was real. Then she snatched it back, clutching it to her chest with a sob that seemed to tear itself from the depths of her soul. The sound broke something in Fletcher, some last wall he'd built between himself and the human cost of this war. The woman tore open the chocolate bar with shaking hands and broke off a piece. She held it to the boy's lips, whispering urgent words in German. The child's eyes opened, barely, and he took the chocolate into his mouth. For a long moment he seemed too weak to even chew. Then his jaw moved slowly, mechanically. He swallowed. His mother gave him another piece and another, tears streaming down her gaunt face. The little girl had lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and was staring at the food with huge, hungry eyes. The woman gave her a piece of chocolate, then took the tin of corned beef with trembling hands. She couldn't seem to figure out how to open it. Her fingers fumbled uselessly with the key. Fletcher stepped forward, took the tin gently from her hands, and opened it. The smell of the meat was sharp in the dusty room. The woman took the tin back and used her fingers to scoop out some of the meat, feeding it to her daughter in small amounts, careful not to let her eat too quickly after so long without food. "Dank," the woman whispered, the word broken by sobs. "Dank, dank, thank you." Fletcher couldn't speak. There was a lump in his throat that made words impossible. He simply nodded and stepped back, giving the family space to eat. Davies stood beside him, both men watching in silence as the mother carefully rationed the food between her two children, taking nothing for herself despite her own obvious starvation. Behind them, footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison. The young officer appeared in the doorway, took in the scene. The German woman and children, the British rations scattered on the floor, his two soldiers standing there like men caught in an act of treason. Morrison's jaw tightened. Fletcher braced himself for the reprimand, possibly arrest. Instead, the lieutenant's eyes moved from the soldiers to the woman and children. Fletcher saw the calculation in Morrison's face, the struggle between orders and conscience, between military discipline and human decency. After what seemed like an eternity, Morrison reached into his own webbing and pulled out his ration pack. He walked forward and placed it on the floor with the others. "You didn't see me do that," Morrison said quietly. "And I didn't see you two do anything, understood?" "Yes, sir," Fletcher and Davies replied in unison. Morrison turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Get them some water as well, and find out if there are others like them in this sector, quietly." He looked back at Fletcher. "This doesn't leave this room, Corporal. What we're doing violates direct orders, but—" He looked at the children. "Some orders violate something. NG more important than military discipline." Over the next 3 days, before the platoon moved forward, Fletcher and several others who'd learned of the situation brought what food and water they could spare to the German family. The woman's name was Annelies. Her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her parents had died in a bombing raid on Duisburg. She had nowhere to go, no one to help her, nothing except these two children and the determination to keep them alive no matter what. The children's recovery was slow but miraculous. The boy, Klaus, regained enough strength to stand and walk. The girl, Marguerite, even managed to smile, a sight that affected Fletcher more deeply than he could have imagined. In that smile, he saw the possibility of redemption, the hope that not everything beautiful in this world had been destroyed by the war. When the orders came to move forward, Fletcher had to say goodbye. He gave Annelies the address of the British military government office being established in the Ruhr areas. He told her, through halting gestures and the few German words he'd learned, to go there to seek help. Whether she would, whether she could, he had no way of knowing. As Fletcher's platoon rolled out in their trucks, heading east toward whatever came next, He looked back at the ruined town. Somewhere in that rubble was a German mother and her 2 children, alive because a British soldier had chosen compassion over orders, humanity over hate. Fletcher survived the war and returned to England in December 1945. He never spoke of what he'd done in Waltringen, never sought recognition or acknowledgement. It wasn't the kind of story that earned medals or commendations. In the official records, nothing remarkable happened in that small German town on April 17, 1945. But in 1963, 18 years after the war ended, Fletcher received a letter postmarked from West Germany. Inside was a photograph of 2 young adults, a man and a woman, healthy and smiling. The letter was in English, carefully written. "Dear Mr. Fletcher, you will not remember us, but we will never forget you. You gave us life when you had every reason to give us death. We are Klaus and Marguerite. We are alive because of your kindness. Our mother passed away last year, but she spoke of you often, of the British soldier who showed mercy when the world had none. We wanted you to know that your compassion created 2 lives that would not exist without you. We have our own families now. Your mercy has given life to our children as well. Thank you is not enough, but it is all we have. With eternal gratitude, Klaus and Marguerite." Fletcher kept that letter until his death in 1989. It was found among his possessions, carefully preserved, read so many times that the creases had begun to tear. On the back, in Fletcher's handwriting, was a single line: "Some things are more important than orders." Thomas Fletcher's story represents thousands of similar encounters, moments when soldiers on all sides chose humanity over hatred, compassion over cruelty. These acts went unrecorded in official histories, earned no medals, received no recognition. But they mattered. In the midst of the most brutal war in human history, they represented the stubborn persistence of human decency, the refusal to surrender completely to the darkness. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.